Hello, my name is Andrew Markle, and this is the final presentation for research methods. So for this project, I kind of looked at many different discourses, and the overall theme is looking at sustainability in architecture and how that can be translated into a larger scale within a city, creating a city that is fully self-sustainable with all of its resources and other uses that are needed to make a city run through the day-to-day. Looking at water, housing, transportation, job use, food growth, energy, and redisposing of waste. So the overall plan was to have all this be within the city, so no imports outside the city are needed and no outside sources. Everyone will live in the city and live in the city, and kind of just upscaling the idea of living in one building. It would be the full city scale. So for the initial case study that I looked at was Terraform One, and they kind of went through this process through New York 2106, looking at what the city would be in 100 years and how it would change with the infrastructure and basically the sustainability of it. So I looked at the different elements and I kind of went through the stuff they were looking at. They were looking at infrastructure, a lot of the greenscape of the city, adding more greenscape to that. And I kind of took it a step further, making it kind of going towards self-sustainability. And that's kind of the discourses I looked at further on. So the first one I looked at was how creating a city that's self-sustainable and adding a new kind of greenscape infrastructure, how it would lead to a healthier lifestyle with people in the city, and how people in the city would be affected in their daily lives, living in this new kind of futuristic environment. And then further down the line, I kind of broke it down even more into its own category, looking at other projects and other past research into three separate categories. So the first one I looked at was social. And then I realized it wasn't just social. There's environmental impacts and economic impacts, and it all kind of goes together to create a sustainable environment. And then I took a step back to the original case study, and I kind of realized that their research methods, they use the same kind of template that I did. So I kind of looked at some of their research, and they did a lot with a lot of like separate studies, but it all kind of translated back to the three that I came up with for creating a sustainable city. Items like household income, being in the economic, occupation being more of social, and racial would be social as well, like environmental, looking at like flood zones, and they did many other studies, looking at each kind of thing. So I kind of used the information that they provided to fit into my new kind of context. The sustainability, I looked at many architectural projects and new future architectural designs, incorporating sustainability into them, creating like buildings that have recycled water, waste management, creating their own food, all within the building. And other projects by Terraform One also looked into that and creating these like large structures. So the city could be just a bunch of these large structures, by themselves, and that's what it would be. But on the large scale, it can be broken down even further to where each building by itself, but the whole city is its own one working environment. So for the final kind of step in my discourses, I looked at this other project that is kind of in the still research part of the project, and it's looking at creating a small little community that can be self-sustainable, and looking at different building types and areas of how it would work out to what is needed to provide for one human being. So this kind of tied back to my original thought of how like one human how their life is, what they need to survive, what they need in their everyday life, and how it affects the city. So these scales show that how like the house where the person lives is probably the smallest needed item in this city. It takes a lot to provide for a single human. And then not just that, it's also the how things are laid out and how things are kind of work together in the community, because it can't just be plops. It has to kind of work together and work as a whole infrastructure. So it's kind of getting rid of the whole grid system in the city and creating a well-balanced, well-laid-out plan for the infrastructure of all the sustainable buildings and programs needed. So that was one of the big contextual elements I looked at was, managing the resources and figuring out what's needed. And then the sustainability was the other main one. Another one was the program, which kind of ties those two together, bringing it all back to, how it's laid out, how the buildings work on their own. And instead of having one building that contains all these, having multiple buildings that serve their own purpose. And then I kind of took one last step back and found these projects by Terraform One also that kind of looked at different building types and how each building had a different method for creating food inside the building and the levels of energy that need to go into it and the product. So that also took me a step back to my own thesis. It made me think, at what point does a certain amount of resource require too much? So you can add more food buildings to create more food, but every time you do that, it requires more resources, more energy, which you need to produce on site. So it kind of got me thinking that there has to be this defined medium between all these buildings and these relationships that kind of come up with the perfect function of a self-sustaining city that can produce everything and need no outside sources. What that is, I don't fully know yet, and that would be the next step in looking at, what is the right mix and how far this can be reached. Because my hypothesis right now is at a certain point, you expand out into the city, and if you expand it too far with the amount of program and the amount of buildings you have, it will reach a point where it's no longer doable unless there's some really, really intricate way to make sure that every person is obtaining the resources and stuff they need. But at a certain scale, you'll pass the amount of people that can live within the city and not getting the stuff that they need to survive. So that is my overall thesis for the whole semester. Thank you.